Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Village of Westport Council meeting. It's Tuesday, November the 19th, 2024 at 5 p.m. and we are in council chambers. Please stand for the national anthem. Please be seated.
We are guests on this shared traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe people, where they built their homes and raised their families. We appreciate these lands for the food, air, water, plants, trees, and medicines they give us. We value the land by swimming and boating, working, camping, and exploring the forests. We promise to take care of this land by not littering or wasting water, composting, recycling, planting trees and flowers, not idling our cars, and saving energy.
Thank you. That brings us to item number 4 on our agenda, which is the adoption of the agenda. It's moved by Councillor Card, seconded by Councillor Crapper, that the agenda for the November 19th, 2024 meeting of council be adopted as presented. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? And that's carried. Any declarations of conflict or pecuniary interest tonight? Seeing none, that takes us to item number 6, which is the adoption of the minutes of the previous meetings of council. It's moved by Councillor Crapper, seconded by Councillor Card, that the minutes of the October 15th, 2024 council meeting and November 5th, 2024 committee of the whole meeting be received and adopted. Any errors or omissions? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? And that's carried. Great, which brings us to item number 7. Our volunteer recognition award. This is a new award, a new policy that we put in place to recognize community nominated members of the community for their time and effort volunteering in different aspects of the village. And I'll turn it over to Councillor Carney.
I'd like to call up Mark Hurley, please. So a group of people in the community have volunteered or have nominated you, Mark, for all of your volunteer hours. You're a very giving person to our community. First of all, with FODA, you give countless hours, you're working, you're helping out where we can, you've got great ideas, you're shaking people's purses for money, you're doing all the good things volunteers do. Then we fast forward to the new Shinny program, and you're doing that. You're helping out, you're getting equipment, you're out with the kids, you're making contact with them so they can have a positive, free experience that they might not be able to afford. We know on Fridays we appreciate Mark working the front door for the Ritos games. He likes to give snacks to all the volunteers. He makes sure no one gets by without paying. He usually has a good scoop or two about something around town. So we did have a nice letter that was written by a group of people that wanted to recognize you for all your hard work, but I thought I would just speak from the heart and just say we really appreciate everything you do for Westport, and especially the community and the arena, and you're very much appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Woo!
And maybe the nominators could go up and get a photo with him as well. Come on, girls, up you go.
No, thanks.
No.
But it was a nice letter, she should write. She should email you the letter.
Congratulations,
Thanks,
Mark.
folks.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you do. And we'll take a momentary pause here, should anybody wish to leave council chambers, they will have some time to do.
Oh, no, part of your
Thank you,
gift is.
everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thanks, team.
I go to the ring.
Good. That was nice. Good job. So, item number 8 is a delegation. You've got the package in your, you've got the details in your package. So Nancy Neal is with us. Come on up to the podium, Nancy. So let's just kind of give some context. Development charges have been bandied about in the media back and forth, and what does it mean? It doesn't really impact us, right? We're going down the new path of doing the studies and the work that's required. But tonight is an opportunity to really, as almost more of an information session that you've got planned, is to share for us and for anybody watching. We get a fair number of people, although they're not in chambers, they watch it on YouTube, that you'll answer a lot of the questions of what development charges are and what we have to do next. So thank you for coming. You don't live local, do you?
No, I do not.
Okay.
3.5 hour drive.
Oh, my goodness, from Toronto? Or east?
The other side of Toronto, actually. Our offices are in Mississauga. I live in Milton.
Oh.
But that's okay. I have family in the area, so that's.
And are you staying with family tonight?
I-
Too much information. We're
I
just-
was going to, but there's a new baby being born today, so their hands are full.
Oh. Well, then we'll tell you now, and we'll tell you when you leave. Watch the deer on the county roads heading back to the 401.
Definitely.
They'll be in front of you. If you look at my car out front, you'll see how quickly they can actually be. If you'll know it's mine, it's the one with the duct tape on it.
Thank you. Well, I will definitely
Be
look out
careful.
for that.
Okay, Nancy, the stage is yours. Go ahead.
Right, thank you. Well, thank you for having me before you tonight, your worship and members of council. We have been working with staff, and we'll be continuing to do so. Tonight really is an overview of what development charges are about. It is a lengthy presentation to give you the background needed. We don't have draft calculations yet. We will be back to you in the next few months to show you that and present what this all means as an actual rate to new development that's taking place. So really, it's just an overview. If you want to go to the next slide. So just a brief introduction of the project and myself. My name is Nancy Neal. I am the manager with Watson. I have been with Watson now over 21 years. Previous to that, I did work in municipal government at both lower and upper tiers for 16 years. So hard to believe. I started obviously when I was 12, but have been working with development charges really since the inception of them. So I've got lots of background information. We do work with, the firm does work with about 2/3 of the municipalities throughout the province that actually have these charges in place. So lots of background there. Lots of your neighboring municipalities have these charges in place and have had them in place for a number of years. This is your first one, so thank you for engaging us to help you through this first process.
And just if I could ask, because it's a tutorial, do you want to go through your slides and take questions afterwards?
That is entirely up to you. What we can do is maybe go through each section and pause
Okay,
at the end of
that's
each
great.
section. Although you may ask some questions and I may say, hold on to that, it's about to come.
Permission.
Okay. So we will go over the overview and sort of the timelines of the project. We have revised those that you'll see that probably aren't in your package, but just a couple of tweaks to that for this evening. I do want to go over the methodology and the legislative requirements that we have to follow. And then also look at what a draft forecast is for your growth over the next 10 years. We are looking out further, and I'll get into that for some types of services, but at least we have a draft right now for this evening. It is draft, it is subject to change, of course. Talk about the local service policy and what the importance of having a local service policy as part of the background study is, so that you understand and that the community and developers understand what that is as well. We'll talk about affordability, because right now there are mandatory exemptions that have been put in place through the Development Charters Act for affordable residential units. And I'll show you what those thresholds are based on what the province has set for you. They will be mandatorily exempt from these charges. Okay, so we'll get into a little bit about that. Talk about the historical service standard calculations that we have to undertake, which really sets an upper limit of what we can include in the charge going forward. So that may, for example, set a limit for expansion of fire services at $1 million. So you might have $2 million worth of work to actually do and expand, but we're limited to that maximum historical service standard of $1 million. I'm not saying you don't have more than that in costs, but I wouldn't be able to include them in calculations. So we'll get into a little bit more of that. Talk about DC bylaw policies. There's statutory requirements that are out of your hands for exemptions and discounts. There's other policies that discretionarily any council can choose to put in place to further exempt, discount types or classes of development, or potentially do a phase-in since it's your first charge. Those discretionary policies is really what makes each municipal bylaw a made in that municipality bylaw, and isn't necessarily the same as your neighbors. And then we're going to talk about the actual public consultation process that's required under the Development Charges Act, and also talk about municipal capital charges, which are not a development charge, but some municipalities use those for certain services as well that are growth related. And then open it up for any final questions or discussions. So just to give you an overview of the project, the Development Charges Act that we're working under is the same Development Charges Act that was put in place in 1997. It does allow municipalities to pass a bylaw to recover the growth-related incremental costs from both residential and non-residential growth going forward. It does follow an established practice that has now been in place where the costs of growth, to the extent possible, are to be recovered from the growth itself. So that helps to minimize the impacts on your current taxpayers and ratepayers. The capital costs that we include in the calculations are those that are in addition to what we declare as a local service, which is why we need that local service policy. There are some things that are internal to a development, if you think of a subdivision, such as internal roads and sidewalks or street lights, that you would require the developer to put in place as part of their development, the local water or sewer mains. Typically, the costs that we put in the development charges are those that have a broader base benefit for multiple developments. So expansion or upgrades of collector or arterial roads, putting in active transportation, putting in fleet and facilities to service those roads. Parkland development that may be located near a new development, but will benefit the whole community by adding, for example, amenities such as a soccer field or an additional ball diamond, or any other type of park amenity. So of course, with fire, library services to expand your collection or facility space. With fire, again, facilities, fleet, or the equipment and gear that firefighters are needed are all a broader base benefit that helps to benefit the entire community. Okay. Sorry, next slide. The key components of the study are the growth forecast. We always have to look at the amount, type, and location of growth. That's our first really component that we need to nail down, because without knowing how much growth you're expecting, it's hard for staff to determine what services they need to expand or upgrade to help service that growth. So that's our first step. Then looking at what that local service policy is, because every municipality can decide where to draw the line in the sand. And below that, it's the developer's responsibility. Above that, it would go into the development charge calculations. And that's important to understand, because when coming to the public process, everyone always likes to say, well, what is the DC that's in place in our neighboring municipalities? And they may have a higher or lower charge. Part of that may be because of where they have drawn the line in the sand to say below this, it's a developer's responsibility. 100% is part of your development. Above this, we put it into the development charge. So every municipality can create their own local service policy. Okay, and that then differs. Someone who says we're going to have the developers do very little, well, then everything goes into the development charge calculations. Others that set the bar higher and have developers do a lot more as the local requirement have a lower development charge. So it's never an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at your rates that'll be calculated versus a neighboring municipality's rates. So I just want to make sure you understand that. The historical service standard calculations, that is not the standard you would approve as part of your determination in a master plan to say, we want one soccer field for every 2,000 people in the municipality. That's a different standard. These are really a mathematical calculation that we'll get into to set that upper limit of what you can include. Then we have to ensure that we have identified the increase in the need for what needs to be expanded, upgraded, to include in the calculations. And there has to be council intent to actually undertake those projects. So this is not a wish list of staff to put in things that they would love to have but don't have a funding source for. It truly is supposed to be related to what needs to expand to service growth that's happening. We'll then obviously undertake calculations. Sometimes we have to coordinate with other local municipalities if we share services with them.
We don't.
Right? So if there are, for example, fire services, if you share with a neighboring municipality or contract. Yeah, so there's different ways of, sometimes there are components that two municipalities share, and you each pick up your own component through the development charge calculations. Okay, so we do have to look to anyone you share with and understand whether it's an actual contracted service or whether you are providing space, vehicles, equipment, etc., that they are paying a capital component to and are responsible for, or whether they're providing something that you're paying a capital component towards. It's not an operating contract. Operating costs are not eligible, so it's always the capital side of it. So if you share in capital expenses, 50-50, for example, you pick up 50% of the costs of any expansion and 50% of the historical values as well for those assets in the calculations. Once we take the calculations, that works its way into the public process to put them forward in a draft bylaw for yourselves. Come back, present this to the public and yourselves for consideration. There is timelines that we have to follow that we'll get into, and then it's up to you as to whether or not you want to pass a bylaw, make any other refinements policy-wise to it before putting something in place. Next slide. The study process right now, we are in the infancy of this. We have been since mid this year having detailed discussions with staff developing that growth forecast, starting to develop those historical service standards, and starting to look at what the future capital needs are going to be. We are here tonight to give you an overview. We are looking to release the background study by the end of the year and then move into that public process. There is a minimum 60 days between releasing the background study and when you can consider and pass a bylaw. Minimum 60 days required. Within that time, you have to hold a formal public meeting to present the findings of the study to the public and allow them to provide feedback and ask questions as well. And then, if we are looking in December to release the background study, it would be March before you would actually be able to pass a bylaw and have it in place. It can become effective immediately upon passage or at some point in the future that you choose to set that. Okay. The public meeting we're assuming will be sometime in February. So some of the methodology, and I know the next slide is very small from where you're sitting.
But we have the slides.
You have the
know that,
slides.
yes.
But it's really a depiction of what we have to go through for the calculation, with that first green box at the top being identifying that growth, the amount, type, and location. Then we look at all the services you provide. Some services are ineligible to be recovered through development charges, so you have to, unfortunately, even though there may be growth needs, exclude those. Then of the services that are eligible to be recovered, we talk to staff and we see whether or not there is an increased need to be achieved to service growth. With that, we then identify projects that will help meet that need. So I'll give you an example of the difference between the increased need and the capital project. You may say we need to provide more parkland amenities. That's great. We need to provide more for the community. The capital project is, what is that amenity? Is it a ball diamond? Is it a splash pad? Is it a soccer field? Is it a cricket pitch? Is it something else? Is it more play equipment for children, etc.? Is it trails? Is it just passive space that you can go and throw a ball around and walk your dog? There's a number of different projects that can meet that increased need for additional outdoor parkland and amenities. The service we look at first. Do you need to expand parkland? Then how do we meet the best need to fit your community and what their needs are? That's the project. We then, of course, when you look over to the right, have to undertake that historical service standard calculation to say, what have you been providing in the past? Does that allow you to recover what your needs are in the future? Or may the cost that we need for growth be in excess of that, because we can't include that then. We then also have to make sure that council is intending to do those projects. Typically, if you've passed a master plan, a servicing strategy, any other report that has come through, business plans, etc. from staff, your capital budget and forecast is an intent to do some of those projects that have been identified, and the development charge study itself will provide intent to do some of this in passing the background study and what's been included in it. Budget times change. We're in the midst of a budget process for 2025. With the approval of your 2025 budget, hopefully this will work its way in the projects that are in here into that 25 budget, showing this new funding source eventually. So we also have to, with any capital projects that are included, identify the operating impacts of that. You don't want to build a new facility and not have considered the fact that the day you open it, you're going to have to heat it. There's going to be hydro costs, you're going to have to staff it, etc. If it's an outdoor park, you're going to have to mow the lawn eventually. So we do undertake in the background some calculations with finance to staff to look at what those future operating impacts will be. And of course, now with the legislation on asset management, we also have to consider, as you add new infrastructure, eventually you will have to replace it as well. And we do a calculation to show you what you should be investing annually once the asset is in place, so that eventually you will be able to replace it when it comes due and do those major maintenance. From that, there's also, for those that have transit services, a whole lot of other requirements. You're not looking to that, so I won't go into that detail at the moment, but it is an eligible service. When we look at the capital projects, once we've identified them, we may have a gross cost of something, and we have to turn our minds to a number of different deductions for those. The first is uncommitted excess capacity. So the development community gets that for free. Typically, we don't like to give things away for free to the development community, but if you were to go ahead and build a project and you had never identified it as being growth related, you can no longer collect through development charges for that. As long as you identified that this was going to service maybe the existing community and the growth community, or fully the growth community, it can be included in the development charges. Where this comes into effect more is once you have a bylaw in place, the next time you're updating it, to make sure that if something comes up in the time between when you pass the bylaw, because things change, and when you do your next study, a new project comes to light that has a growth component, but wasn't contemplated during the study. It doesn't mean you can't fund the growth component from DCs. You have to have the proper approvals in place to say, this portion of the project, fully or partially, is growth related, and we intend to collect it through development charges. Okay, as long as you have that intent, then when you do the project, you've actually built in committed excess capacity for that future growth, and that you can still recover from DCs in the future. Okay, so it's a little bit of an odd one.
It's really in the weeds for us.
It's in the weeds, but you need to understand, because a bylaw, a development charge bylaw can last up to 10 years. A lot changes in 10 years.
Well, was my idea to, like, just to clarify that, so between the bylaw and any subsequent revision of the bylaw, we would have to have identified priority projects that were growth related.
Right.
Correct.
So if those aren't in place when this bylaw passed in March, yeah, that's pretty limiting, eh?
Well, you amend it.
It can be. But there's ways, you must undertake a background study at least once every 10 years. There's nothing stopping you if something significant changes, whether that be with the amount of growth or the projects needed to service that growth. There's nothing saying you can't go in and update all or a portion of the study throughout that 10 years. And that has happened in other municipalities where all of a sudden the growth gets accelerated and it's like, whoa, we weren't expecting all of this. We didn't embrace all of this. Let's update the study sooner to get, more projects put in there because we need to add that in. Okay. The other thing we have to turn our minds to is benefit to existing. So if you're replacing and expanding a project or replacing and upgrading. So let's say you're going to replace a 1-ton dump truck with a 5-ton dump truck that can service more roads that are being built in these new developments. There's an incremental cost difference. That incremental cost difference is the growth related component. If it's like for like, you're just gonna replace a 1-ton with a 1-ton, that's asset management for your existing assets and it's not growth related. So we always have to look at what is the incremental upgrade or expansion that's happening that will help to service growth. If you're replacing books in the library that exist today, that's just replacement. If you're adding to your collection, so that, if you have 3 items per capita now, you want to continue to add 3 items per capita as the population grows, that's the incremental cost that can be covered through the development charges.
So who's gonna ask the question? You want it or you want me to ask?
Go ahead.
So the question, the elephant in the room, everybody's looking at the tops of their tables, growth in a wastewater system that needs to needs to expand for growth. Can you walk through that for us, please?
Yeah, so if you have to expand a wastewater treatment facility.
So start with the environmental, the ECA first of all. So that's where we're at.
Yep.
And then walk us through how much is eligible for DC, if you don't mind.
Well, a portion of the EA is growth related in itself, because you're looking to say, how much will that EA, maybe identify a portion that of the system that needs to be upgraded anyways because of legislative requirements, versus how much of the EA is going to really be focused on what needs to expand for the plant, how much more capacity is needed to service all the growth that you're looking at. So a portion of that EA process might be a benefit to the existing community, but the majority of it is probably related to looking at what you have to do to expand for growth.
And the money invested in the EA prior to the March bylaw, is that still eligible?
It depends if it's still ongoing or if
Yeah.
it's already sunk costs. If it is sunk costs, then no.
If the EA is still underway?
If it's underway, then yes. we
Okay,
can
thank you.
include
That was the other question in the room. I'm watching them twitch.
And then once it's determined, you know, right now, you know, for example, there's 1,000 liters per capita per day that the treatment plant provides, and it says you need to expand up to 1,500 liters per
Right.
capita per day to be able to service growth. The cost to go from that 1,000 to 1,500, that's the growth component.
Right,
That allows for the new growth to happen.
right.
The only time there would be a benefit to existing on that type of expansion project is if you have current customers that are on, say, a private septic system
Mhm.
that could connect
Oh, fair enough.
in as well. Well, that is an existing household, but yeah, it's a new customer for the wastewater system, but it's not new growth.
Yeah,
It's new growth to the system, but not new growth that would be issuing a building permit
understood.
to build a new home. So you couldn't impose that component
That makes
of the
sense.
capacity they're gonna use when they come off their private service and hook to the municipal service.
And we know we sidelined you, and if we have to skip some slides at the end, that's
That's
okay,
okay.
but this is really the burning question. Counselor Aragona and Counselor Carty, your hand up as well?
I answered it, thank you.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Counselor
Thanks for you,
Aragona.
your worship. Thank you for explaining the water wastewater capacity. And I'm hung up on the uncommitted capacity that's on your chart. Can you tie that into what you just explained about water
So-
wastewater?
I can. So if you went ahead and were finished your EA and it said, yep, you have to expand by 500 cubic meters per day, right, or liters per capita per day. And you went ahead and did that project.
Yeah.
And it was there today. It has excess capacity. But there's never been a development charge to say that that capacity was being put in place for growth.
Right,
Well, that's excess in the system that exists today. The development community gets that for free. You can't then include it.
so the growth analysis that you're gonna do, I know you're gonna get there, but if we've been simmering with these questions. So the growth analysis that you're gonna do, the 10-year plan or whatever we're gonna get to.
Yeah.
20 slides along here.
Yeah.
Will marry up with the analysis of the EA.
It will marry up with a draft of it. It may, if the EA isn't complete yet,
It's not, yeah,
then we will have to rely on a draft of that and what it's telling us that.
so let me put numbers to it. I'll use your numbers. That if, for the growth that's happening, your study shows that instead of the 300 that we use a day, we're gonna need 600 a day. We wouldn't have your study as part of the EA. There would have been some other calculations done. Does Watson's numbers that you would do help impact the outcome of the EA?
It could, but there is information already right now for your wastewater treatment plant as to the expansion that's anticipated and how much growth
Yeah.
that is going to service, and we're actually mirroring that.
Okay, all right, that's fair. I didn't want you set, you're on the point. I didn't want you to set the
Yes.
numbers.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry for jumping in there.
And
Joe.
that's
You
fine,
done?
and I'm going to get to that when we get to the growth forecast.
Okay,
Okay?
so you done,
Covered.
or you-
Thank you.
anybody else, something coming out of that? Barry, go ahead. Counselor Card, go ahead.
We talked about uncommitted growth. What about committed? So
That's no brainer. It gets included.
it gets included. So we have this much capacity, but we've already committed it to a project. And so whatever's left to do, the project's not quite finished. It doesn't have to be a completed project or completed development. It can be partial
That's right.
partway through the process.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, the other thing we need to turn our minds to is for deductions from the gross costs is any grant subsidies or other contributions that are coming in. So another contribution could be a fundraising event for indoor recreation facility or a park, or an amenity in a park. It could be a donation that comes in or a benevolent fund that gets put towards a project. The grants and subsidies, of course, are limited these days, but we can't more than fund 100% of a project.
So what did you say?
So
Sorry, I don't think we all
have
heard
to
that. Deduct, okay.
any grant
Grants.
subsidies or other contributions
But
anticipated.
not OSEF or anything like that.
So, yes, the only thing we don't have to is, the old gas tax.
Okay.
You're right, it's now the Canadian.
Yeah,
Canada
whatever,
Community.
CFIS or
See,
whatever.
right. That is actually just a funding source.
Right.
And you can use that towards any project, doesn't have to be a growth related project. It can also go to the benefit to existing component that gets deducted if you want to. So it's a funding source. But any other grant program that's out there that you are applying specifically for a project,
Which is OSEF, I get your point.
Then-
Not OMPF, okay.
then yes, we have to deduct that because if the project's $1 million and you get $500,000 through OSIF, well, we're not gonna collect $1 million through development charges, we're only gonna collect the
Understood.
difference,
Understood.
the other half, right? So we do have to consider that. Again, if there's shared
We
services.
wish we got 500,000.
I'm not throwing numbers out there as examples, but, yes, we do have to consider that.
Okay.
If you are sharing with a neighboring municipality with a service and they're paying a proportionate, my example, you know, if it was a 50-50 share with neighboring municipalities for, say, a fire truck, then you only pick up your 50%, we deduct their 50% from the calculations, okay? Because again, you don't want to collect more than 100% of the project that you are responsible to pay for. Once we get the net costs, then we also look at financing. So if you need to undertake a project upfront, and that often happens with water, wastewater, and roads, the project needs to be put in place before you can actually issue a permit and someone can connect to the system. Quite often that means you're undertaking the capital works well in advance of when all the development that's going to benefit from it is coming. And therefore you may have to actually issue a debenture or take a loan to do that work. The financing or interest costs on that debenture are also eligible to be included in the calculations. So you're collecting both the principal and the interest
Okay.
towards that capital. Okay, so that's important, and we deal with finance staff once we have the full project listing in place to look at the timing of the growth, the timing of when the projects are going to happen, and decide whether or not we put some calculated estimates in for financing of some of the projects. Okay, and then with that, we divide those calculations into the benefit of those costs that will service the residential growth that's anticipated versus the non-residential growth. Now, most of your growth is residential, but there is a little bit of non-residential growth that is anticipated over the forecast. And then we divide those back into the first step, which is the growth, and that's how we calculate the charges in its simplest terms. Now, the next few slides, I've talked a lot about.
Yeah, and I'm watching
Already,
the
and
clock
we're
and
gonna
everything.
fly through some of them.
So we're fine without their, you can see they'll speak up if there's something that
Yes.
they want to catch you on.
Is
Good,
there,
Jennifer.
oops, sorry, I think you flipped two. There we go. So the Development Charges Act sets out specific services that are eligible. Water, wastewater, stormwater, services related to a highway, which is all your roads, including public works facilities and fleet to service the roads. Electrical power services, although there isn't any right now that are owned by municipalities that are being recovered. For Toronto, the subway extension for York. Transit services, waste diversion, not landfill, only waste diversion. Policing, fire, ambulance, library, long-term care, parks and rec services, public health, childcare and early year program. Provincial Offences Act, which also includes bylaw enforcement. Emergency preparedness, and for Waterloo Region, they get to collect for expansion to their airport. Those are the only services that are eligible. What I've highlighted in blue are the services we, with working with staff, are looking at to include in the calculations. Now, you'll notice there's a couple there, such as stormwater management. Typically, stormwater management is the responsibility of the developers as part of that local service. So I'm not saying you don't have stormwater needs, but typically we're including those as a direct developer responsibility. Emergency preparedness is the other one. Okay,
It's not blue though.
it's not blue. What we include typically for emergency preparedness is maybe updates to the plans, as you have to update them occasionally. That can still fall under the growth-related studies that we can include. But typically, emergency preparedness, if you're looking for space or equipment, it's not dedicated space. There are a few municipalities throughout Ontario that have dedicated emergency preparedness space or dedicated radio systems or other equipment for it. Most municipalities, though, have facility space that may be converted in the event of an emergency. You may use this room as a command center.
Recycle, we do.
Right. You may have a community center that you would house people at if they're displaced in an emergency. The predominant use of that community center is recreation, non-emergency preparedness. The predominant use of this room is for the general administration of the municipality, for council meetings and other staff meetings that take place during the day. It's not for emergency preparedness. Quite often the radio systems used by fire, police, public works are also then used in the situation where you have an emergency, but the predominant use is for those services. So we don't typically see a lot included in development charges for emergency preparedness, and that's why.
And so does the upper tier take into account long-term care, ambulance?
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of those are upper tier responsibilities. They, you know, would have to embrace it in a development chart of their own if they needed to expand any of those services. Okay, so you cannot include anything you don't provide a service.
Understood.
Okay, even if it's
Taxes.
eligible. Okay, so just a little brief overview of the history of development charges. As I mentioned, we are working with the 1997 Act. Prior to that, if we go back in time, between the 1950s and 1989, municipalities through the Planning Act could impose a charge when a lot was created. They were called lot levies, and it was to recover capital costs at that time. There was a lot of different things happening throughout the province with different requests of developers taking place through that regime. And a lot ended up at the OMB at the time through a lot of complaints and appeals. So the province put together the first Development Charges Act in 1989. And it really allowed municipalities to collect 100% of the growth-related costs they had from growth for any service that you provided. In 1997, there was a major overhaul to the Development Charges Act, and it reduced what municipalities could collect to between 75 and 85, 90%, depending on the services you were collecting for and the amount of growth you were having. And that's because they made some services ineligible. They introduced mandatory reductions to the calculations for some services. They also introduced mandatory exemptions for certain types or classes of developments. So you are no longer, when you hear the term growth pays for growth, growth has not paid for growth since 1997 fully. The existing community has always had to pick up a portion. That 1997 Act, although it's the one we're still working with, as you can see to the right, has had a number of amendments to it. You will see a list of 10 there. Only 9 of the 10 actually changed the Development Charges Act, and I'll explain the 10th one. But really, since 2019, there's been about 2 different changes to the Act annually. Some of those changes have further reduced what you can recover from development. Others have added some things back in that you can collect for. Some earlier ones took things out and have now reverted back and added them back in. But overall, municipalities are still noticing that there is less that they can actually recover from growth, which means your existing taxpayers, ratepayers are still funding a portion of growth-related infrastructure. Okay, so just understand that. I have all the bill numbers that took place. The next slide really gives you the name of all of those bills that took place. I tend to look, use the bill numbers because the long names are difficult, but they're there for your reference if you wanted to look into any of them more specifically.
And I'm trying to help you here because we've already been at this 35
Yep,
minutes.
and I'm gonna start flying through these.
I don't know flying, just in the back of your mind, what a new group of people need to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Know that we're gonna have you back, so I'm not trying to rush you, but
Yeah,
I don't want you to
I
have to talk for more
understand.
than an hour.
Yeah, so
Okay.
some of the
Appreciate
notable
it.
changes that are going to impact you of all of those changes are the historical service level calculations. We used to have to look back 10 years. So the act used to say you cannot charge future growth any more than what you provided on average to your existing community over the past 10 years. We now have to look back 15 years, which if you haven't been putting infrastructure in place to stay pace with the growth you have had, sometimes limits that maximum calculation of what we can include going forward. So it becomes important to make sure you're staying pace with growth going forward and putting infrastructure in place in a timely manner to ensure that you don't erode away that historical mathematical calculation we do. Rental housing and any type of institutional development. For the most part, development charges are payable at the time a building permit is issued. For these types of developments, they now have an automatic deferral where they will pay their development charge in 6 equal installments, with the first installment not being due at building permit issuance, but at occupancy permit. And then on the anniversary of that occupancy for the next 5 years, they pay another installment. As well, there is a rate freeze in place, and this one's very important for you guys. So for any developments, residential or non-residential, that are proceeding through site plan approval process or a rezoning process, the rate that is in effect the day they apply for their application for site plan or rezoning is frozen. Currently, if I was to come in today, the rate is 0. I'm frozen at 0. Then, depending on when the approval of that application took place, will depend on when that rate is frozen for. So for any application that was applied for site plan or rezoning, as of January 1st, 2020 and June 5th of 2024, the rate is frozen at 0 right now for you. If the approval of that application happened by June 5th of this year, they have 2 years to pull their building permits from the date you approved their application, and they pay the rate that was in effect at the time they applied for it. So if I applied in January 1st, 2020, but you didn't approve me until June 1st of this year, I have 2 years from June 1st of this year to pull my building permit, and I still pay 0. If the approval happened after June 5th, so as of June 6th, that 2-year window between approval of my application and my building permit gets shrunk from 2 years to 18 months. So there are developments that are anticipated in this growth forecast going forward that are already going through one of those processes and are frozen at 0. If they pull their permits within the timelines allowed, they will not be imposed a development charge. The portion that you can't collect from them when you go to pay the projects for the capital will then have to be funded from other sources. So there is still very much, and this has hurt a lot of municipalities, especially those like yourself that are just starting to put a DC in place. It could be for a lot of the developments a couple of years before you actually start to see some of the revenues coming in. So that is important to understand for you, that this is going to further limit what you can collect from growth. Once the charge is in place, anything that gets applied for after that will be frozen at that rate that is in place for those timelines. Okay, it really means that you want to try and shrink the timeline between application and approval of that application, for purposes of making sure that the time clock starts ticking as to the rate freeze. Once you have a DC in place, any applications that actually have a rate that's more than zero frozen, you can impose a maximum interest rate on that. As well, you can impose that maximum interest rate for any of those deferrals for rental housing or institutional developments on the installment payments. And the prescribed maximum rate is the average of the 5 big banks prime rate plus 1%.
Councillor Irigoyen.
I don't mean to jump ahead on your presentation, but everything you just explained makes complete sense. But if you could just tie this to local service policy and capital charges for me, please.
I will. So the local service policy has nothing to do with this. That's 100% the developer's responsibility. That is not in a development charge. They still have to fully pay for all of those local services, which is why we're working with staff to say where we draw the line as to what's their responsibility. That has nothing to do with this rate freeze.
So what I'm trying to understand is how the local service policy can or should be defined.
Well, it should be defined with, a lot of things in mind. First off, you can't extend it to, for example, lands that are so far away from a development where you want to do road improvements or upgrades, for example, that would benefit the entire growth community. If it's something 5 kilometers down the road, they're not gonna have access to it. An expansion to that may be triggered because of their development, but they're not gonna be able to actually put those works in place. It's too far away from their development. So usually when a local service, it looks at what's internal or external and abutting. It can be external and within the area to which the plan relates, which allows you to then go slightly off-site. So if you think about if a road needed to be upgraded and you wanted sidewalks in, but there's another 100 feet of sidewalks connect to the next one that's off-site from them, from their development, well, are you really gonna just leave it empty? Or would you ask them to put that extra 100 feet in to connect? You can do that, but there's a reasonableness. 100 feet is one thing, 5 kilometers is another. You would put that connection for 5 kilometers into the development.
So any infrastructure that's abutting the development area
Can be
included in local service. Can you then tie it to capital charges and?
With the municipal act?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that one if you can hold that thought. Okay?
And we've got 20 minutes.
Yeah, so, additional residential units, you can now add up to 2 additional residential units as of right in an existing home or in a new home. They are mandatorily exempt. If I come forward with an application to add an apartment in my basement and to convert my garage to an apartment, you can't impose a development charge on those. If I come forward with a new building permit for a single family home with that apartment and the garage apartment, the basement apartment and garage, you can only impose on the first unit, which is the single family home, not the other 2 apartment units.
So let's say that again, because we have some large lots. This group may not appreciate that the 2 units, the 2 additional residential units are by right, that every property owner can add them without having to change the zoning bylaw or whatever, they can add them.
Right.
So when we
they
have future discussions about coverage of property, I want you to remember that bullet point.
Yes.
But tell me now, because I have a large lot, if I wanted to add a granny suite and renovate my basement, if this is in place, how's that work for collecting DCs from me as a,
We wouldn't be able, you wouldn't be able
because
to.
they're both by
impose.
right?
They're both by right allowed to be exempt. It doesn't have to be in or attached.
Right,
It can be ancillary
Yeah.
to the unit.
Yeah.
And they are both exempt. Now, there's planning rules that are changing that will allow for up to 3 more additional units. That third additional unit is not mandatorily exempt right now from development
and
charges.
federal government funding for 4, if you separate,
Right.
right, but
Right.
3 and 4 would be DC of both.
4 would be. So if it's a new unit.
Yeah.
The first unit.
Yeah.
And the fourth unit would be DC eligible.
Okay.
But there's 2 other units would be exempt.
Okay,
If it's an existing home and I'm adding 3 more.
Yeah.
One of those 3 would be eligible for
Gotcha.
DCs.
okay, yeah, thank you.
And then, of course, there's also the statutory exemption for affordable and attainable housing. Now, attainable housing, though, both of those came into effect June 1st of this year. However, attainable housing, we don't know what that is. It's defined as, it's not affordable and it's not rental housing, but what else it is, could be a tree house, we don't know. We've heard all kinds of rumors, but we really don't know yet. But that can be prescribed at any time. Once it's in place, it will override your bylaw and you'll have to mandatorily exempt them. Nonprofit housing or any affordable housing that might be in an inclusionary zoning bylaw are also mandatorily exempt. What we do know is what the affordable thresholds are, and I'm going to show you that. There's also a statutory exemption for any universities receiving ongoing funding from the province, as small or large as a campus may be. That is the one item of the 10 items that have changed that you will not find in the Development Charges Act. It actually was put through as a mandatory exemption through the Training Colleges and Universities Act, that they are exempt from development charges. So if you've got any type of small campus in Westport, you wouldn't be able to
Sad for
impose.
that campus.
Well, it happens. There's also a mandatory discount for rental housing. Now, rental housing for this discount is defined as a development that has 4 or more units, all of which are for rental purposes. The developer has to enter into an agreement with you to ensure that these units will stay for a minimum of 25 years. Same with the affordable and attainable. They have to be in place for at least 25 years. If the rental housing meets the 4 units or more that are for rental purposes, depending on the number of bedrooms in each one of those units, they get between a 15 and 25% discount per unit off the rate. So if it's a 1-bedroom or bachelor, they get 15% discount. 2 bedrooms units get 20% discount. 3-bedroom or more, they get a 25% discount off the rate. Again, the life of the bylaw used to be a maximum of 5 years, it's now 10 years. So for you, your first one will be up to a maximum of 10 years, but again, it doesn't limit you from updating it sooner. There is a requirement for anything related, any development charges collected that are related to water, wastewater, or roads, which is the services related to a highway, that annually, through your budget process, 60% of the opening balance of those DC reserve funds have to be spent or allocated to a project. So if you collect $100,000 in a wastewater development charge, then the next year, you have to at least identify a project that will pay for 60,000 of that. You have to spend or allocate. It says allocate because the province recognizes that some of those bigger projects are a number of years between EA, land purchases, design, engineering, construction, etc. So it can take a number of years to get it done, but you have to show that you are actually allocating that money towards specific projects. Okay, that's a requirement that is also needed as of 2023 in your FIRs. Okay, if you have DCs in place. And there is an annual requirement of the treasurer to provide you with a statement with all the ins and outs that have taken place in each one of the reserve funds for each service. And that has to be posted online annually and be kept online for the entire term of the bylaw, along with the background study and the bylaw itself and your current rates that are in place.
Okay.
So your draft growth forecast, before I get into that, is there any other kind of legislative questions you have at the moment.
Councillor
Yeah,
Carter.
just to clarify, the local service policy, does it have to be implemented or developed first, or is it the DC, or they at the same time?
It can, most often it's at the same time. It will be appended to the background study. And it will clearly say X, Y, and Z are 100% developer's responsibility. A, B, and C will go into the development charge calculations.
Thanks.
There's nothing stopping you from approving that ahead of time, but anything that you're saying is gonna go into the DC isn't in a DC yet. So sometimes what staff do is get approval of that just before the approval of the background study and bylaw, or they just approve it as part of the background study. And we're not looking to reinvent what you require your developers to do now. We're wanting to make sure it's transparent, because there is what we call the no additional levies clause in the Development Charges Act that says you cannot require a developer to pay for or put in place any works that aren't identified as either their responsibility as a local service or will go into the development charges. Doesn't mean you can't negotiate with them to do the work on your behalf, but then they get payment back for anything that is a development charge project through credits or payments at some point. Okay, so it's really important to have that local service policy clear and transparent as to what they are responsible for, so they don't come with their hand out after you've asked them to do the work and they've done it and said, but your local service policy didn't say it was my responsibility, so pay me back for what I did for you. So that's why it's important, and typically they go together very closely in approval or at the same time. Okay? So the draft,
Everybody good?
are we good with that?
All right.
So at the moment, we've looked at your 10-year growth forecast, and what that looks at is a net population increase of about 450 people, a gross population increase in the new homes of 632 people. The difference between that is we always recognize in the calculations that there is a natural decline in existing units, and I'll use myself as an example. I have 4 children. There's one left at home. At one point, we were 6 people per my unit. As they have grown up and gone out, we are now down to 3 people per unit. The fact that 3 of the kids have moved out have freed up services that my unit was using. Okay, so we always make sure that we're only looking at that incremental increase in the population, assuming the natural decline. Of course, the other end of it is sadly people die off eventually and are showing a lower persons per unit in your existing overall population as well. So we do take that into consideration in the calculations. The new units in the 10 years, we're looking at about 267, most of which are in low density, which are single family homes and or semi-detached homes. There are some medium density, so townhouses, for example, or row housing would fall into that, and some high density. Now, typically that's apartments, but what also falls into the high density are those additional residential units, those apartments or granny farms. Okay, so we are anticipating some of those in the next 10 years as well. On the non-residential side of things, as noted, we're only looking at a small amount of additional non-residential growth, about 19 additional employees that will be housed in new buildings, most of which would be commercial or population related, so stores, you know, dry cleaners, all that sort of things, restaurants, etc. Couple in the light industrial area, and then a few in the institutional, which could be a daycare, for example. So what we're anticipating based on average floor space per worker, which differs depending on the type of industry it is, or commercial or institutional, is about 12,100 square feet of additional new building spaces in the next 10 years. Now, I want to pause there and just note that for the wastewater and the water, because of the draft information we have, we are going to be adding to this a projection that is a longer period that will be to the build out of the capacity of that wastewater treatment plant. The timing of which right now in the background data is estimating around 2043. But whether that ends up being 2039 or 2048 really doesn't matter, because what we're gonna do is tie the growth that is going to be serviced by that expansion to that cost of expansion. So the timing doesn't matter as much. So you'll see in the final document a build-out forecast, which is based on that build-out of the wastewater treatment plant capacity for that service. So that's what we're still trying to finalize with staff, and isn't ready for tonight to show you, but I did want to note that we will have a longer period of time and more growth identified to be serviced from that expanded plant. Just as a quick overview, you have been averaging around 7 or 8 units per year of residential, with the last few years really being what's pushing, and you've been over that. We are anticipating an average of about 27 additional residential units, new units, being added over the next 10 years, based on applications in the process and everything else that we know, including some of your line supply. Okay. Again, we know that there's more growth coming, and there's more phases coming to some of the developments that are happening now. Some of those will be what is required to be serviced from that wastewater treatment plant expansion. However, we also know that some of the lands that are in some of these additional phases actually fall into a neighboring municipality's lands right now, based on the border. And some of the servicing that we may be putting in place might service those lands as well. We cannot include the component of the costs that may service those lands to your neighboring municipality. That we would have to deduct, and then they would have to pick it up in their development charge, unless at some point there was some other arrangement between you guys that you would annex those lands into the village, so that the development is fully in one municipality versus shared between the two. But that's a whole separate planning process that you have to go through, that we're not going to worry about for this, but we do have to recognize that some of the development that's anticipated in one of those phases actually falls in the real. So we will have to do a deduction for their component on our calculation. Okay, the local service policy, again, really, the typical things we look at in there is what the developer has to pay for, typically at 100% of their cost. Sometimes they're shared costs though, where maybe some of those works that are abutting may be shared. And what is their share? They pay 50% and then 50% goes into the development charge, or are they required, if it's abutting, to pay 100% of those costs? Okay, that's what we're working out on, as well as how they would be paid back for any work that they do on your behalf if the projects are in the development charge.
So this is a local service policy, something you are doing.
We are developing it with staff
Right. I mean,
to ensure that
obviously.
it's clear as to what the developer's responsibilities will be for works internal to their subdivision, as well as works
And
external
this
and
comes back to
abutting.
Councillor Cardy's question.
Yep.
We will likely get it in January.
Yeah, you'll get it with the background study in
Okay.
December. It'll be appended to it.
All right, good.
Okay.
Good, yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question too.
Next slide. Typically, what we see included is the requirement for the roads component and anything related to the roads, sidewalks, streetlights, etc. The water and wastewater, the linear pipes or pumping stations that have to be put in place to service those municipalities. Typically, treatment or storage goes into a DC because it's got a broader base benefit, but the local pipes and stuff are the developer's responsibility. Stormwater management, if you have a pond, holding tanks that are required on site, those are typically at 100% the developer's responsibility. And then parkland development is an interesting one. And every municipality chooses to do things differently. So I always look at parkland that there's 3 levels of parkland. The first level is what you require the developer to do. So most municipalities, when they get land dedicated through the Planning Act as part of a development, you might want to park out or something in a subdivision, don't want to take raw land. Most municipalities want the developers, at the very least, clear it, rub it, make sure it's not being used to stockpile dirt when they're digging out basements. And that it's somewhat graded and have some cedar sod on it. That way, until you have the time to go out and fully develop it and put amenities on it, if I'm out there running around with my kids and my dog and I trip, because it's uneven land, coming back to, sue the municipality, that you don't want. So typically, there's a base condition, at the very least, that you want the developers to provide that land map before they convey it to you. That cost and value we don't include in the calculations. Once you have that park, to go in and develop it further, which is your level 2 development by putting in additional maybe flowers or shrubs or trees, park benches or garbage receptacles, or level 3, bigger amenities like a play structure or a ball diamond or a soccer field or a splash pad that don't go into every single park. It's the level 2 and 3 development that we typically see in the DC. Now, I have municipalities that require the developers to do everything for level 1 and 2 as a local service. And then only level 3, those bigger type amenities that you decide where you want to put them, is what goes into the development charge. And that's where I come back to comparing apples to apples doesn't always work. So your municipality can choose to have the developer do as much or as little of that parkland development as part of their local service requirement. Okay? Things such as fire and library don't typically work their way in because those are broader based projects that you would never have a developer build those as 100% their cost. Okay?
Quick question.
Go ahead.
Does the freeze scenario apply to any of this local stuff? Okay.
No, they're still required to pay 100% of that. Yeah. So that's where we want to make sure with staff, we're drawing the line in the sand below that. They still have to pay 100% of that. Above it, if it's in the DC and they're under a rate freeze, which is 0 right now, they won't be paying their component. Okay? So that's part of what we're working on with staff on that policy.
Okay, so we need to figure out where we're going, because we've talked about the affordability. I know that the council would really like to hear the bit of the, more information on the municipal act capital charges.
Yeah.
So, if you want to touch down on a couple of spots, I mean, you've already done most of it.
Yeah.
But we haven't really, I know Councillor Argona asked a question about the municipal act capital charges, and we would like to know.
Right at the end.
And, well, we've got 4 or 5 minutes, so.
Okay, well, I can flip through it. Your affordable unit thresholds that are in place for this year are outlined there. Anything that's built below that for either purchase price or rental price will be mandatorily exempt. That gets updated annually by a bulletin put out by the province every May 1st going forward. Okay, so that's just for background information where you are totally right now. Again, the historical, if you want to keep going, the historical service standard calculations on slide 24 there is a mathematical calculation based on what you've had in place over the last 15 years. We look at quantities and qualities, quality being the replacement values today, and we do a mathematical calculation that sets that upper limit, and you'll see those calculations at the next, like as part of the background study. Okay, capital costs that you can include in there is anything to acquire land or an interest in land, except for parkland, that you have to get is either conveyed or cash in there. It's the only land for an eligible services you cannot include in the calculations. Once you have the land, you can develop it and pay for it through DCs, but you can't acquire it. And then anything to improve it, anything to lease or acquire or construct a building is eligible. Your equipment, as long as it has a life of 7 years or more for your fleet and equipment, is eligible. And then capital components of lease, if you lease space or lease vehicles, the capital component is also eligible, as well as your collection materials for the library and interest, of course, on any financing needed and growth-related studies to determine what you need to put in place. We've talked about, and I'm going to fly through the next ones, about all these deductions for excess capacity and everything that we have to take into consideration. So I'm going to go right by those. Bylaw policies. If you can go to slide 30. On the left-hand side, you will see all of the statutory requirements that we will put forth in a draft bylaw. you cannot get away from those. Your hands are tied, and we'll just build in those rules as well as definitions needed for those rules. On the right-hand side is the discretionary exemptions, and that's really what is up to you to put in. Do you want to exempt any other type or class of development? A type of development might be a place of worship. A class of development might be industrial or non-residential in totally. And as long as you are treating everyone in that class or type the same, you can choose to exempt it, but you can't do one-off exemptions. I like, you know, developer A, but not developer B, so I'm gonna exempt developer A and charge developer B. That's not allowed when they're doing the exact same type of development, okay? And that could be for residential, non-residential, could be phase-ins you want to charge depending on what the calculated rate is. Those are all up to you.
Quick
Go ahead,
question, could you exempt a certain value of a home? So if you had residential, someone, so I saw the affordable housing, but let's say you decided $1 million homes were going to pay the development charge, but not $500,000 homes.
Then you're setting a different limit on
Can you do that?
affordability. Sure you can,
Yeah.
as long as everyone that's under that $1 million, you treat the same.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. The public process, again, I touched on it, 60-day minimum period between background study being issued publicly and bylaw passage with a public meeting required in there, and there has to be notice of that public meeting put out as well.
And so anticipating the public meeting, you know, challenges, it's gonna be winter when we hold it, but is it a regular, does it follow the same rules, the same format as any other planning public meeting?
It pretty much,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
You have to open it, we have to present the findings,
Right.
you have to listen to any public comment or questions.
Documented,
There'll be questions
Yeah.
of council, and then at the end of it, you close it. You will not be passing the bylaw that night.
right, no, that's fair.
And you can set a timeline for when you can still receive comments prior to that bylaw passage date.
So the comments come in to our planner, or to you,
To
whoever?
No, it would come in through yourselves.
Okay,
We would help to then respond to
Respond.
any written questions that come
Yeah.
in. We help to
okay,
provide written responses back to those people. And then you would be copied on those responses as well as through your council packages.
that's
Okay.
right, thank you.
And then just to note, once you have passed the bylaw, there is a 40-day appeal period where anyone can appeal the bylaw to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Okay, and that's a whole separate process if that happens. So here we are, municipal act charges.
Thank you.
Which is the last part of the presentation. So there are other funding tools outside of development charges that can be used. And they are capital charges that can be imposed under Part 12 of the Municipal Act. Now, the difference between this and the development charges is, of course, development charges can only be imposed on new development when a building permit is pulled. Municipal Act capital charges can be imposed on new and existing. So sometimes municipalities have both in place. So for example, if I'm extending the wastewater treatment past existing homes that are on private services, and I'm expanding the plant for them as well as the linear so that it gets to the developments. The proportionate share that is for those existing homes or businesses coming off private services and connecting, well, should they be getting that for free, or should they pay their proportionate share towards the infrastructure as well? So quite often for new growth, municipalities have a development charge in place, and for existing growth, they have a pseudo development charge, same rate basically, that each pay their proportionate share. So if I'm a new single family home, I'm gonna pay a development charge of X.
Yeah.
If I'm an existing home coming off my private septic system and connecting in, why would I be charged something less
Understood.
than what the new is? So you can have the municipal act charge and the development charge be the same rate, inflate at the same time annually. However, there are municipalities that have chosen for water and wastewater services to not impose a DC at all, and to impose all of it through a municipal act charge. Whether you're new or existing, you're allowed to impose it through municipal act charge. Now, some of that, there's, you know, different rules and regulations.
Which is a connection fee, in essence,
It can,
which is what we,
right, well, it can be a connection fee. Not all municipalities through a connection fee impose an amount for the vertical infrastructure. It's just linear, and to actually connect and blow a hole through that pipe, to then get up to your property. So it's
Okay.
whether or not the linear and the vertical
Yeah.
are in there or not. You can update your connection charge to include the vertical if it's not there,
interesting,
okay?
yeah,
But yes, that's all through the municipal act, and you can impose that on the existing and new, or just the existing that are gonna connect to the system. That's up to you.
okay,
So there are municipalities, as I mentioned, that choose to only have for water wastewater services, the municipal act charges, and everyone's treated the same then.
okay,
Okay, some choose to have municipal act for the existing and a DC for the new.
the new,
Up to you. Some of the things that I want to point out on that, the municipal act charge allows you to collect for both capital and operating expenses, where the DCs only allow you to collect for capital expenditures for incremental costs. The imposition of a municipal act capital charge can take place at the time of completion of the project. You don't have to wait until they actually come and want to connect and get a connection permit or a building permit for a new home. So if you put the expansion in place next year, whether they're connecting or not, you can impose the charge right away.
oh,
Okay, now, quite often what happens is the charge is at an amount that, you know, might be, for example, $10,000 for a home. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't have $10,000 laying around. So quite often what happens with municipal act charges is municipalities allow for a payment plan of 3, 5, or 10 years. You can choose whatever time period that you may want. So I might be allowed, you know, able to pay it over 3 years, but my neighbor might not be able to pay it that quickly and might need a 5 or a 10-year plan with you. You can impose interest on that charge as well for any outstanding installments. Okay, and then you have to cash flow it yourselves internally. But quite often that happens because an existing homeowner doesn't have that cash readily available, but you can impose it on them. Next slide. The collection of the charge, again, as I mentioned, can be immediate or over a period of time with interest. You can index it, similar to how a development charge, we will set up your bylaw to have it annually inflate to keep in pace with inflation. We will be costing everything in $2024 because we're releasing the study in 2024. However, when you go to do projects that are going to be in the DC 3, 4, 5 years from now, you'll be paying in inflated dollars. So annually, your DC rates will be updated to stay pace with that inflation. There's a prescribed index that's based on non-residential construction price indexes in Ontario. There's 2 different series, a Toronto series and an Ottawa series. I would assume you would, similar to others, inflate based on that Ottawa series. Just so you know, over the last 5 years, that has been about 45% of an inflationary impact on construction. And it is following actual tender prices in the area. So we would want you to make sure that you impose a mandatory inflation to the DC. And if you have a municipal act capital charge, you would want to inflate it by that as well and have that in the bylaw to be based so that they stay in tandem with each other if you have both. Or if you just have municipal act, you again want to be able to pay for the costs in those inflated dollars, the actual costs.
very good.
Okay, so that's something I would recommend. The final charges to be imposed through a DC is actual costs, including any of that indexing or financing costs if you need to actually cash flow it yourself. The big thing when it comes to the differences with the public process, it's not a formal public meeting. There's no formal public process required under the municipal act to pass that. However, we would recommend that you let the community know that you were going to pass a bylaw or update your connection fee bylaw to include indexing if it's not there and whatever a new charge would be, just for fairness. Although you're not legislatively required to do that, okay? And unlike the development charges, if there's an appeal of that municipal act bylaw, it doesn't go to the Ontario Land Tribunal, it goes through the regular court system. And it can, even with, so as an example, a few years back, there was, Kingston had one of these charges. And it got appealed through the court system because the developer didn't like the charge. And felt that it should be in a development charge and not in a municipal act charge. The court decision was that they were in their right to include it in a municipal act charge and not a DC charge. The developer didn't like that decision and he then appealed it to the higher court. And luckily for Kingston, the higher court upheld the lower court's decision that the municipality was in the right to collect it through municipal act versus DCs. So it is an option for you.
What costs? The taxpayers hope.
Just wanna let you know
All
that
right, we're
there
gonna
is a different process that you have to go through.
Okay,
Typically then, what is included in a municipal act charge? Typically it's water and wastewater, although I have also seen roads in there. And Tay Valley, for example, is now looking at putting local road improvements in a subdivision that has been abandoned by the developer. And they're going in to do the works and recovering that cost from those lots that will actually benefit from those road works. So it's not limited to water, wastewater, or any other service, but typically that's where we see it the most. And then what do you consider is a local service? That's still the developer's responsibility. And you may not put in a municipal act charge or a DC. This is where you can draw the line in the sand. So usually the local collection and distribution systems are developers' responsibility. Sometimes that line comes up and localized pumping stations may be the developer's responsibility. But if it's so far off site that they can't do it, and they're larger pumping systems, sometimes that larger ones go into the DC, the smaller localized ones stay as a local service. You know, trunk systems that are needed throughout town to be upgraded or expanded or put in place typically go into the DC because they're usually so far off site, the developer doesn't have access to do that work. Obviously, supply of water, treatment, and storage are typically what you see in a DC. Okay, same with the wastewater, treatment of it, as well as if you have a lagoon system for storage example, that's typically what you see in a DC and or municipal act charge. So where you draw the line in the sand for that bottom can go up, but it has to be reasonable. And then above that, if you want to use municipal act versus DCs, that's up to you guys.
are you gonna ask a lagoon question?
No. I was
Okay, you
gonna
go
ask-
ahead, I'm gonna ask a lagoon question.
I'm just following up on, so is the study that you're doing and working with staff on going to include any recommendations or suggestions or approaches to the municipal act capital charges?
We're talking to them about that
Yeah, it's a good idea.
right now. Because the other thing to keep in mind is with the municipal act charges, there's no mandatory exemptions. There's no mandatory discounts. The way there is in the DC, where there's no rate freeze, you can impose the full rate. So it might be a better solution for some of the work you need to make sure that you can actually recover the cost from growth versus zero for up to maybe 2 years for applications that are in the process and frozen at the current rate.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. There's part of this is strategic for the next 10, 15 years. And there's the here and now. So our direction to staff would be to work with you in that regard, and we'd like to see that come back and move forward.
Yeah, we can do that for sure.
Okay.
So that's my presentation. If there's any other questions,
Thank you.
I know it's a lot, But you've got copies so that you can, mull over it and.
Yeah, unfortunately, our manager of public works isn't here, but the required homework for him will be to watch your presentation. You're working with Peter anyway.
That's true.
Yeah. Nancy, thank you so much for coming. It was very informative. There's many days I think I know 98% of what goes on in this world with the other jobs that I have, but I learned a few things today, so
Yeah.
thank you, and
That's great.
the council feels the same way, they're head nodding and it's all good.
Good stuff.
So I'm gonna say it again, please be careful of the deer when you're heading south to the 401. And thank you for coming, we look
Thank you.
forward to you coming back in whenever, December, January, yeah, New Year, that's
Stay
fair.
overnight that time.
Yeah,
I may.
yeah, well, then it'll be winter, it won't be the deer, that'll be the ice.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much. Nice meeting you all.
Okay,
Thank
and we're just gonna take a 5-minute break, guys, so if we wanna go off camera for a couple of seconds. That would be great. Motion to accept.
We're at motions, I have a motion.
Do we have a motion for her? No.
We're
No,
at-
just a dead page, nothing, okay, good.
Grandchild due the week of one of these meetings, so I may not be around.
Okay, we're back?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll call the meeting back to order. And that takes us to, so thank you very much, again, although Nancy has left the room, thank you for that presentation. And although council had the opportunity to read the slides and the background piece prior to it, we're hoping anybody who was watching online, you've got a good sense of the purpose of the DCs, why we're doing the study. Some could argue we should have done it before, but we're doing it now. They're expensive and we had to set aside the money in our 2024 budget to take care of it and partly in 2025. So it's always about money. That's the reason why we didn't do it 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm going to move now to number 9, motions and resolutions. And the first is the administration, the 2025 meeting schedule. Do you have that in your package? Okay, I just want to point out to you 2 changes. If you go to May and June, we're adjusting those weeks. I'm traveling those months. Oh, here comes the new updated one. I'm traveling those months, the first weeks of both May and June. So we've just backed it off. Instead of it being the 1st and 3rd in May and June, the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, it will be the 2nd and 4th Tuesday in May and June. So if you've already got them in your calendars, other organizations I've met, actually, they send out meeting notices once this is approved. Could you do that? All right, so you do it on a Friday afternoon, so that you're not getting 24 messages when you're busy working on a Wednesday morning, but at least send it into your calendars. So that's the amendment, is May and June team. So I've read the motion, approve the meeting schedule as presented at the November 19th council meeting, and any discussion.
Can you just make that as amended if that's the case, not presented? Scratch it, presented, yeah, thank you.
Great. Any discussion, team? All right, I'll call the question. All in favor? Carried. Okay, 9.2 is administration, the RVCA membership. It's moved by Councillor Card, seconded by Councillor Crapper. The council appoint Councillor Aragona to the RVCA board for the remainder of the council term. Any discussion?
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for picking that up. We sure appreciate it. I'll call the question before he can change his mind. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Good job. Thank you so much, Councillor Aragona. I was on it for several years and loved it. And 9.3 is administration Serenity Garden project overage, moved by Councillor Crapper, seconded by Councillor Card. The council approves staff to draw the additional funds from the cash in lieu of Parkland Reserve to cover the final invoicing of Serenity Gardens. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Just carried. Just reminding ourselves again that we've got to put a bit of a budget in for 2025 to prepare the garden for the spring. I had remember staff reports number 10. 10.1 is the asset retirement obligations. Those are 3 words you probably never thought you'd put together before you ran for council. Moved by Councillor Cardy, seconded by Councillor Aragona. The council received the report entitled Administration Asset Retirement Obligations for Information Purposes. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Carry it. 10.2 Administration Facility Use Agreement Library Board. Moved by Councillor Aragona, seconded by Councillor Cardy. The council receives the report entitled Administration Facility Use Agreement Library Board, and the council approved the facility use agreement as presented at the November 19th, 2024 council meeting. Before I open it up to the floor, I'll say that our CAO has been very committed to this, and our treasurer. The agreement was put together. The consultation occurred with the library board, was back and forth a couple of times. But thank you for moving this forward in that it was one piece of many that, I know Councillor Crapper has been involved in the discussions as well. So that's our kind of our public appreciation. Thank you very much for getting it done. Councillor Crapper, go ahead.
Yeah, I will like to share with you guys that the library board members are all totally supportive of this. And I'd like to thank Kim and Denise as well for their work, and Jamie Chapman, who did the lion's share from our end. And yeah, it's an improvement. It's not anything but, and I think the Bloom scenario and some other examples of committees changing structure and doing better as a result will be what we see at the library. And there's a renewed energy, and I think, you know, the lesson learned is people, when given the latitude to do things the way that they can do it, with less cumbersome structures around, tend to, especially volunteers, do a better job of that work. So I'm excited to be part of that, and thanks again.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I like the way you worded it. But sometimes you have to have that tension created by the structure that you described for everybody to stand back and say, there's got to be a better way. That still is effective and meets the needs both of the municipality and the library board. So I'm quite excited, and we'll see where it shakes out. And there's a couple more things to fall out, but any other comments by anybody in relation to this? Okay, call the question then, all in favor, and that's carried. Terrific. So we're gonna go to bylaws. Just thinking here, I thought there was one more thing that we had on there, but apparently not. So 11.1 is now we're moving to, we normally have a meeting in between or time in between, but with the amount of consultation with the facility use agreement with the library, we felt that you'd likely be comfortable going right into the bylaw and approving it. So certainly if you'd like to stew on it for a couple of weeks, that's fine. But I'm gonna actually read that bylaw motion. So it's moved by Councillor Cardy, seconded by Councillor Aragona, that bylaw 2024-34 being a bylaw to establish and authorize the execution of a facility use agreement with the library board, be read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed this 19th day of November 2024. Any concerns with just moving right into it tonight?
The only question is there have been no changes through you to Kim in what the board and Jamie looked at last week. So what's there was done good.
Yeah. Okay, good question. Okay, we'll call the question. All in favor? Good. Oh, good. I can hear library board happy already. And then 11.2 is we're getting a lot of the administration stuff caught up. That's really good. It's been in the works for a while. This next is the MOU with the Friends of the Arena. It's moved by Councillor Aragona, seconded by Councillor Cardy. That bylaw 2024-35 being a bylaw to establish a memorandum of understanding with the Friends of the Arena. You read a first, second, and third time and finally passed this 19th day of November 2024. Councillor Cardy, any comments?
Oh, just, I guess to say that, it's always better in writing that we have an understanding, and, we're asking very little of the municipality. It's basically, just to cover some legal issues that, on our part as a charitable organization. When I say our part, I mean FOTA. And, we're more than pleased with the agreement. The village is, considered helping us with some administrative things, giving us a place to have our meetings and giving us a home to get our work done. So we're very pleased. Hope it works out well for everybody.
Yeah, well, we appreciate the work that you do. And in both of these instances, what's important is to document, and sometimes it's just an easy way to say it, so people can stay in their lane and they know what their lane is. And they know what the other lane is defined as well, and it supersedes the term of any member of council. So I think they're really important to get in place. So thank you for your comments. Anybody, anything else? All right, I'll call the question. All in favor? And that's carried. The confirmatory, any notices of motion from anybody tonight? Okay, any announcements? Hockey team's doing well?
There's lots of announcements, right? There's
Okay.
the tree lighting, right, this Friday. There's the shop and hop all around town. You get your picture with Santa at Trevor Connell's. There's like lots of business in the ugly sweater competition. Then there's the Santa Claus parade on Saturday at 2, and it's gonna be a great weekend in Westport.
So I'm gonna add a couple of things, because the Westport Arts Council has their outdoor Christmas market on Friday from 12 to 5. They've moved this year. The businesses asked, would they move away out of the parking lot in downtown, so a little piece of Church Street from Bedford to the driveway into the liquor store and the hardware. That's where they're gonna be set up from 12 to 5. Rain, we won't go in freezing rain, but the temperature is gonna be warm enough and the rain looks minimal. And then Saturday, for all the singers out there, everybody loves Christmas carols. The Westport Arts Council Community Choir, some kind of choir, has their Christmas concert at 7 o'clock. Knox Presbyterian hosts it, they're wonderful hosts. And it's just a free will offering, and the money goes to help with things in the community. So we've got shopping, art, ugly sweaters, photos, singing. And we are all in the Santa Claus parade on Saturday. So for anybody on live streaming, watch us, it's gonna be amazing. Any other announcements? Hockey team is doing well, they're in second place, yes, still got that right, that's awesome.
Game on Friday.
Yeah, game on Friday. Okay, questions from the public and questions from the media. Anything, Suzanne? Oh, great. So the confirmatory bylaw. It's moved by Councillor Gona, seconded by Councillor Cardy, that bylaw 2024-36, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings at its meetings held on November 5th, 2024, November 19th, 2024. You read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed this 19th day of November 2024. All in favor? And that's carried. Brilliant. Moved by Councillor. We're gonna go to adjournment. Everybody good with that?
Mhm.
All right. Moved by Councillor Cardy, seconded by Councillor Aragona, that this meeting of the Council of the Village of Westport be adjourned at 6, or then I forget to look. I get silly with you and I forget to actually look at the clock.